We're never going to know many of the details leading up to Julian Harvey's killing spree that fateful night. However, there was a lot that investigators were easily able to figure out, even though Terri saw very little. For instance, we know that Julian Harvey intended to murder his wife, and that the motivation was her life insurance policy. As you recall from earlier episodes, he had taken out a large life insurance policy on Mary right before they had left on the Bluebelle voyage, double if it was an accident, and he already undoubtedly murdered a wife prior, whom he had also taken out an insurance policy and profited from. So therefore, Mary was his intended target, not the Dupperaults. He had wanted to make it look like an accident, but something happened that caused the Dupperaults to get in his way and made him feel as if he needed to murder all of them so there would be no witnesses. Although Julian Harvey was obviously a terrible person, he wasn't by any means stupid. He was above average in intelligence, capable of pulling off some elaborate schemes, and well educated. He had also almost gotten caught once, as you recall, prior with another wife whom he had driven off a bridge with his mother-in-law at the time and drowned them. Divers had noticed some odd things about the wreck, and there had been suspicion drawn towards Julian. After Julian Harvey was picked up, many people noticed that he had scratches all over his face and on his arms, which he attributed to wire cutters when he was busy trying to save the Dupperaults and his wife, a story that didn't make any sense. However, authorities later realized that Mary, his wife, had long fingernails. Hence, it doesn't take much intelligence to understand that Mary obviously fought back, probably harder than Harvey had intended when he had suddenly tried to kill her, and this alerted the Dupperaults, probably Arthur, because Arthur was always hanging out with Julian trying to learn more about being a skipper because he wanted to one day be one himself. So what more than likely happened was Harvey tried to murder Mary while they were in their room together, in their cabin together, the small one up in front. And he had probably left Arthur distracted. And when Mary fought back, she survived long enough to alert Arthur, who didn't realize what he was walking into. Harvey would have come at him with a surprise knife and slashed him. At that point, Arthur undoubtedly would have probably retreated to go get his gun, although we can't know for sure right there, and was slain somewhere in that process. So Mary and Arthur were probably killed first. Now, after Julian Harvey killed or seriously wounded Arthur Dupperault and Mary, his wife, he then would have pursued Jean Dupperault, Arthur's wife, and Brian, because Terri heard them screaming right before there was noise. It sounds as if Harvey went and retrieved the gun and shot them, but he might have stabbed them, and that explains why when Terri came right outside her cabin, she saw her mom and Brian slumped over in a bloody pool. So they would have been killed last, more than likely, with Renee killed sometime in between, or in some way harmed and knocked overboard in sometime in between. It is possible Renee was killed right afterwards as well, since she was only 7 years old. Now, since Julian Harvey was found with Renee's body, that obviously suggests he intended to be found to bolster his bullshit story. That he was near the lighthouse when it happened, and that he had tried to help them. Either Renee was knocked overboard, therefore, or Harvey drowned her, because there was an autopsy done, and they know for sure that Renee was drowned. Hopefully, Renee just drowned being knocked over. It's kind of horrific to think that Harvey might have held her underwater, but either scenario is possible. Some have wondered why Julian Harvey spared Terri rather than just shooting her. I think the answer to that is very obvious. There has been one explanation which is ridiculous, that Julian Harvey wanted to get caught, that he had a sense of guilt. Psychopaths don't tend to want to get caught. They don't tend to feel guilt. That's one of their defining characteristics. And he had committed so many horrible crimes with nothing suggesting guilt whatsoever that I think that can easily be debunked. It's simple. Julian Harvey didn't see her as a threat. She was just a kid. He figured she would go down with the ship. It wasn't worth his time to shoot her. Now, Harvey probably intended to murder Terri when he said, "Here, hold the line to the dinghy," because at that point she had made herself a nuisance, and it would have made him more nervous. But Terri made the right decision at that point and let go of the rope, saving her life and causing him to leap overboard in the dinghy. At that point, I think that Julian Harvey came back looking for Terri, and when he didn't find Terri, he instead found her little sister. He might have honestly confused her for Terri at first. Seeing her bobbing up and down, she would have been face first in the water, having drowned. And he took her out of convenience. Not long after Captain Cusadontis rescued Terri, he telegraphed the Coast Guard in Miami. Picked up blonde girl, brown eyes, from small white raft, suffering exposure and shock. Named Terri Jo. By now, Terri had fallen unconscious. Captain Cusadontis had heard a radio report earlier about a shipwreck survivor and to be on the lookout for other survivors of the Bluebelle, but he hadn't thought much of it. It's a very large area after all, and he didn't expect anything to come from it. Overnight, Terri became the most famous girl in the world. The Coast Guard sent a helicopter to pick Terri up and bring her to Miami. The Greek sailors waved goodbye, some with tears in their eyes, thinking to themselves what unimaginable hell this girl must have been through, things that many people probably wouldn't even survive. She had earned their respect in the short time she had been with them. The helicopter took Terri to Mercy Hospital in Miami, where she was able to give her name again before falling into a coma. Reporters crowded outside with cameras, but none were allowed in. With high temperature, kidney damage, low blood pressure, Dr. Verdon, who was in charge, had her room switched to avoid reporters and from anybody else coming in and disturbing her, fans or whomever. Eventually, an armed guard would stand outside just in case the perpetrator tried to find and harm her. Within 24 hours, though, Terri would be on her way to recovery, being a young girl of healthy body. And she would be writing nurses within that time to wake her up, perhaps because her dreams brought with them bad memories and nightmares. As Terri was being rescued, Julian Harvey, right at the same time, was in that interrogation room, which I read off part of it last time, and I'm going to read off a little more now. He was continuing to make fabrications after fabrications, and there might have been some tinge of truth in the details. That's up to you to figure out. But ultimately, the cause that he said was a lie, and most of it was utter fabrication. The same questions remained. His obvious incompetence when he has far too much experience to be that incompetent. The lack of a storm that was seen by the people at the lighthouse. Nobody saw the storm that Harvey claimed occurred. No flames, nothing to suggest the Bluebelle was on fire only a few miles away. Murdoch finally said, "When you saw the other bleeding passengers, who was bleeding besides the doctor?" Harvey replied. My wife. I'm certain she was bleeding. I don't remember if the others were bleeding, but they may have been. One thing Harvey didn't know, while pretending that he was doing all the work and everybody was just standing there flummoxed, was that Dr. Dupperault actually wasn't a greenhorn sailor. He did have more experience than Harvey had ever realized, having sailed various crafts on Green Bay and Lake Michigan. Those little facts might have eventually led to Harvey once again coming under major suspicion. The others had moved away from the fire. The doctor held the vessel on course I'd given him until he abandoned and went back on the fantail to jump overboard with the others. That Terri, Joe, Brian, and Renee, they were wearing life preservers. There were 2 life rings on the ship's rails. Murdoch replied. Was everyone awake at the time of the accident? Harvey replied. Everyone was awake. The little 11-year-old girl was screaming. I tried to keep her quiet. She probably had a nightmare or something. She didn't know what was going on. She woke up and wasn't wildly hysterical, but was in quite a bit of a shock. Murdoch told Harvey that he was dismissed for now, and Harvey went and sat down in another chair. Now he was about to hear Harold Pegg's testimony. As Harold Pegg began to give his own testimony, at that moment, Captain Barber rushed into the hearing room. "You're never going to believe this," Barber further explained. "That girl, Terri, she's alive." The room was filled with cries of surprise. However, Harvey's response was quite different than everybody else's. He turned pale, began shaking, stood up, and screamed, "Oh my God!" The people all around Harvey, excited that the girl was found alive, looked stunned. They looked over at Harvey, who then tried to smile and said, "Isn't it wonderful?" As Julian Harvey made a hasty retreat, Murdoch turned with narrowing eyelids, suspiciously said, "Don't you want to remain for the rest of the testimony? You have that privilege, Harvey." Harvey shook his head no and gave a weak smile. Then he asked permission to leave and was allowed to go. Julian Harvey walked downstairs and went to his car that was parked on a street nearby. He took out his briefcase, but left the car parked there. Next, he hailed a cab and took it a block or 2 away to Biscayne Boulevard, a very busy section of Miami full of tourist and Cuban immigrants. It was a bright sunny day, warm. A wind from the North Providence Channel, ironically, could be felt gusting through the air. Motels and hotels littered Biscayne Boulevard even back in the 1950s and 60s. One such motel, then, was called Sandman. It was located along that bustling area. Sandman motels back then were cheap, comfortable chain motels, very recognizable in the 50s and 60s. I purchased a postcard from the exact motel Harvey stayed at to research this case. Now, the Sandman Motel that Harvey stayed at that day hasn't been there for decades, but it was pretty much your standard 1 to 2 floor motel with a swimming pool, bed, dresser, and television. The kind of motel that is ubiquitous in America even today. Clean, cheap, usually clean. At 11 a.m. that day, 2 hours after he began being interviewed by Murdoch, and just after he left, he checked into that Sandman Hotel in room 17 under the name John Monroe. Outside, people swam in the pool and lounged in the sun on lawn chairs. The motel workers remember Harvey walking upstairs with his suitcase and a paper bag, and after that, nobody saw him. Right after Julian Harvey had left, Murdoch and Captain Barber alerted the Miami police and ordered a Coast Guard posted outside Terri's room. He simply was way too suspicious at this point. The story didn't make any sense. His behavior was odd and disturbing when he screamed and looked around. He had looked very creepily at Murdoch, and then he became reserved and walked away like somebody who was about to go to the gallows. One of his fellow pilots, back in the days when he had been younger, who had been assigned to test the ditchings of the B-24s with Harvey, recalled him, saying, because of his wartime record in those early days, his good looks and his many decorations, he had had a very egotistical air. He wore a special cut Eisenhower jacket, pearl pink chino trousers, and a yellow scarf. Harvey was considered a hero, and no one challenged him in his wearing of his unconventional uniform. Back during those years, Harvey had mastered his stammer and spoke with aplomb. He had been, at least on the surface, the knight in shining armor, the guy who could say, "Don't worry, I'm Julian Harvey, and I've got the situation under control," and people would believe it. The knight, of course, had been somewhat of a lie, but at least back then some of it had been true, or he could have convinced himself that it was. Those years were gone. That Harvey was gone. Now he was again the stuttering freak he had been in his early years of high school and middle school. Harvey had always been a vulnerable narcissist who didn't feel like he could really be loved. But the vulnerable part was now a much bigger aspect of Harvey than the narcissist part, and the narcissist part could no longer protect him anymore. He didn't believe in himself. His son Lance, his friend Boozer, his buddies that sailed with him in the military, they were going to know he was a monster and a failure. Since way back in high school, after he got bigger and more confident, Harvey had always been popular. He had been rich, he had been privileged, he had had yachts, and he had women. Oh, he had had a lot of women. And many of them spoke about him being one of the most handsome hunks they had ever been with. But wild spending had destroyed his wealth, and although he was still a good-looking guy, I don't think having a history as a wife murderer was going to do him any favors anymore in the dating department. Plus, being on death row wasn't going to give him access to women anymore either. And there wasn't anywhere for Harvey to go. Had he stayed in the Bahamas, they would have executed him. The only difference there is he would have been hung rather than get the electric chair. Sure, he was still a respected war hero and pilot, but being the most hated man in America was going to take that away from him too. And it probably didn't help crushing his self-esteem that he was losing all this, that he had been beaten by an 11-year-old child. And so what did he have to look forward to now? He couldn't change anything that was going to happen to him. They were going to find him. He was certain to meet a shocking end, literally, at the electric chair, whether under federal or state law. The government loved to use an old Sparky. Nor would it take a long time to get the death penalty back then. However you feel about that, that was the way it was. Within a few years, they usually would execute you. Charles Starkweather, a few years earlier, a spree killer, had been executed by the electric chair after only 2 years of appeals. At some point during the evening or later that night, Harvey began drinking a lot of beer from the bottles that were in the paper bag. Getting plastered, or at least buzzed, probably made it easier for what he was about to do next. Harvey carefully placed the bottles right side up in the trash after he had drank from them, a habit that he had always practiced. It made it easier for the maids to handle them. He was always a polite gentleman, except for when he was trying to kill you, terrorize you, or abuse you in some way. Harvey wrote on a piece of paper that he had taken from his briefcase in his usual clumsy scribble, more like that of an elementary student than a college-educated man. "I'm a nervous wreck, and just can't continue. I'm going out now. I guess I either don't like life or don't know what to do with it. And it was addressed to his friend James Boozer. Afterwards, he sealed the envelope. And he scribbled on back, cremate and bury at sea. Then he thought about it, and he scratched out cremate and underlined the words bury at sea. Next, he placed the envelope squarely in the center of the desk, and at one side he put the briefcase, which contained a picture album stuffed with images of his life. He took out a double-edged razor blade, and he went and sat on the bed, and he cut himself a little bit. And then he decided he wasn't going to hurt himself there or cut himself anymore there, and he moved into the bathroom. But before he did, he turned back towards the bed, pulled out a $10 bill from the pocket, and pinned it to the pillow. Probably as an apology to the maids, because of the horrible sight they were about to see. Maybe he still thought of himself in some ways as a gentleman. Then, after he went into the bathroom, he cut himself on his trouser leg, and blood began spreading over the leg. He probably winced at this point. And he removed 2 pictures from the album that he had taken. One was of Lance, and another was of his wife, Danae, Mary, which is kind of odd. Maybe he did regret killing her, or maybe not, who knows. He put those 2 pictures on top of the toilet tank, where he could stare at them as he then sat down on the cold floor. Then, with thoughts I can only surmise, he began to slash his ankles frantically and angrily, and he slashed his wrists, and his forearms, and his thigh, very, very deeply. These were deep gashes, like red smiles. And he even cut his neck. Deep, deep. Must have been thinking, die! Die, goddammit! Next day, a maid knocked on room 17. It was hot that day. And when no one answered, the maid unlocked the door and went in. The air condition was on. Felt cool. But oddly, she immediately felt anxious. There was something strange about the room. And she smelled a slight odd odor. One that she wasn't used to. Now, one of the twin beds was rumpled, and when she went over to it and pulled on the sheets, she noticed the splotches of blood. Nervously, she then began to walk cautiously over to the bathroom to collect the towels, but she couldn't open the door. Something was on the inside, or maybe it was locked, and here that smell was far more noticeable, and she felt nauseous. It was the sickly, sweet smell of blood, that copper smell. And without even having seen the body yet, she screamed, and she went to the motel manager and brought him back in as quickly as she could. She knew something horrible was on the other side. They telephoned the police, and at 12:14 that day, a young, strong officer knocked down the door with his shoulder, and then he sprung back. There they saw the blood-covered body of Julian Harvey, sprawled face up on the tiles. Maybe he was drunk enough to where it was a little bit easier for him to do this, but in any event, it had to be painful. His corpse was mutilated. He attacked himself with the frenzy in which he killed his victims. This was a guy who didn't just want to die, he wanted to torture himself first. And Harvey was given his last wishes. As per his will, he was taken off the coast of Miami, his corpse, and buried at sea. His son Lance, who was also a victim of Harvey in different ways, was adopted by a couple who was taking care of him and sent to a military academy. The response to Julian's suicide and Terri's survival story caused such an international sensation that Terri became this inspiration for millions of people who saw her as this saint and paragon of virtue. She was being sent presents left and right by the public. There were dolls, stuffed dogs, games. There were so many presents that they were littering the floor. But Harvey did have some defenders, mostly people who knew him personally. They couldn't reconcile their experiences with such a gregarious and friendly person, someone with such charisma, with that of someone who would do such evil. Through denial or extreme ignorance, or both, there were claims he was a war hero and patriot, and that monsters wouldn't have his kind of military record. Harvey had been well known in Miami. John Boozer said Harvey had been very depressed over his wife on the nights he had been staying with him, and he had made him swear to secrecy and never tell anyone that it had been cowardice, not sudden drowning, that had caused their deaths. Harvey basically just altered a few minor details with his story that he was telling the Coast Guard, and said that he immediately fled and didn't try to help when the mast fell through and caused the ship to begin sinking. Boozer would eventually conclude that Harvey was indeed responsible. Life magazine, which was a tremendously popular publication back then, a little like a mix between People and Time, did a cover spread of the Bluebelle with Terri floating on the cork. And they did it that same month because this story was so sensational. It even came before the death of Rockefeller. Despite all the horrible things he did to her, Terri has never said anything bad about Julian Harvey. She didn't see him kill anybody. She doesn't want to live with bitterness. And that started right away as she was a child and to this day. It did, however, hurt her that some people didn't believe her story, including Mary Danae's brothers initially back in Wisconsin, who were not convinced their brother-in-law would lie and do those types of things. Early on, in the aftermath of Julian Harvey's suicide, even the people who knew he was guilty could not figure out what the motivation was. Nobody was sure why he would suddenly go on this rampage. Then, oddly enough, an anonymous telephone caller reached out to Mary Dean Harvey's brother, Harry Jordan, and told him to check the traveler's insurance in Miami. Now, Harry Jordan looked into this, and that's where they found out about the life insurance policy Harvey had taken out. Whoever that caller was, nobody knows. They either knew Harvey or knew about his personal affairs. Harry did a lot of research into Harvey's background after the tragedy, and Harold changed his mind, deciding that Harvey was guilty, saying, "He conned her. He said that he was a big shot when he was nothing but a bum." Harry also said that he had spoken to a friend that knew Harvey, and Harvey had once suggested to that friend that if he bought an airplane, Harvey could wreck it and make it look like an accident. Harvey had lots of experience wrecking planes and boats and coming out of them alive. Perhaps Harvey's most vocal defender was his sister, Susie. She was 1 year younger, born in 1918. And she said that his military record wasn't consistent with what that child was saying, and that he was a wonderful man who loved life. and you can see her quotes above, her more specific quotes. She died in the early 80s. I don't know if she ever changed her mind, but obviously she was quite devastated about this situation. She really loved her brother, and they had grown up together. That's actually Harvey and her in those pictures, both as teenagers and as babies, if you're watching the video portion. So, as I said earlier, she quickly